Question comes up, what can I do to get over the guilt? So there's a couple different things we need to understand if we're talking with clients about guilt. First of all, we have to start with discussing the difference between guilt and shame. The simple answer to the question is guilt is happens when I act against my value system. And in some respects, that means that there's some comfort in that, because good news, you're not a psychopath. You have a value system. You have a series of beliefs about morality that you have internalized. And what's happened is you've acted outside your value system. So guilt is when I made a mistake. Shame is often coupled with guilt, often put together with guilt. And shame is a different process. Shame is about being excluded from the tribe because your behavior is not within the tribe's limits. And it's terrifying because back in the day, if you got excluded from the tribe, you died a pretty painful, generally uncomfortable death. I mean, it was really pretty bad idea to get excluded from the tribe. So we're going to talk first about the idea of shame versus guilt. You're going to feel guilt differently. It's going to be usually in the gut, whereas shame is really deep in the gut and also has sort of sometimes some sensation in the face or in the hands and arms for whatever reasons, like a blushing with shame. So you feel that process differently. And then we're going to explore with the client, what is it they're really experiencing? A lot of times they're really experiencing shame. And at that point, we're going to talk about some affirmations and some messages around acceptability that I can give to myself. And we're also going to explore where in my family of origin or my growing up years did I get the messages that you don't belong and that you're not enough, right? So it's a different pathway than resolving guilt. So that's the first thing, is that if I'm working with a client to resolve guilt. Are they really experiencing guilt or is it shame? Often it's both, and we have to spend some time with each one. When it comes to guilt, the idea of forgiving ourselves is very similar to the idea of forgiving other people. We're taught in the Judeo-Christian tradition, forgiveness is a great virtue, which I think is delightful and that's wonderful. And we're sort of taught to just do it. There's not a lot of sophistication in terms of the education for forgiveness. What people don't understand is that the forgiveness process is very much a grief process. Okay? One way of thinking of grief is you are forgiving the world for taking something away from you, or forgiving yourself for being so attached to whatever it is you are grieving. And so the grief process is something that I utilize when a client is dealing with guilt. And grief, I really like the Dabda Model developed by Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza in the 1970s. There are lots of people who've tried to make some improvements on it, and I think it's great because it's simple and easy, and it resonates with a lot of clients. And it works like this. I start out with denial, and then I move to some anger and bargaining. Okay, then depression or despair, basically feeling the pain, and then acceptance. Now, in the original model, she was working with people who were dying. They're diagnosed with terminal illness, and they experienced these patterns very predictably, one after another. In reality, you can bounce around quite a bit and have lots of, kind of space between the five. And so, denial is pretty straightforward and just pretending I don't feel guilty. Anger is when I'm angry at myself for what I did, okay, or I'm angry at somebody else for putting me in a position to do what I did. Bargaining is when I replay the event again and again and again and imagine how I should have responded in an effort to sort of create a different outcome in my past, but also to teach myself a lesson. And a lot of guilt is this element of things. I'm going to teach myself a lesson so I don't ever make that mistake again. And then despair is the meat of it. And despair or depression is the part where you just sit and feel the sensation. Oftentimes it is accompanied with tears. Sometimes it's accompanied with just feeling like a big piece of junk. Really, really awful. And what I do with clients is I facilitate them into walking into that and allowing it to just process through. That's been the conclusion that I have. My experience is that there is some sort of emotional mechanism that I don't completely understand, and it has stacks of emotion. One of the things I'll discover if I feel guilt about some behavior is that I'm actually feeling guilt, because a lot of times people say, I feel super guilty about, not wiping off the counter today. And we dig into it, and their guilt's a 10 out of 10. And I think, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Why is the guilt so severe? And so we'll talk about that. And what we discover is one of two things. One, they have really unrealistic expectations of themselves and deep perfectionism, which again is its own clinical issue, and that can be addressed. And as it gets addressed, the guilt will diminish. Or more likely, they actually have a series of material and behaviors that they have felt a tremendous amount of guilt about. This is particularly true when I'm working with people in our treatment center, because a lot of them come out of, when you're in addiction, you do things that are built for survival and that are generally not good for other people. They're good for you. And if you have a value system that includes taking care of other people, which hopefully you do, if you don't, we have a whole different set of stuff to take care of, right? But if you have a value system that includes taking care of other people and you go for several years, really fundamentally taking care primarily of yourself and failing to take care of others, you're going to have a series of this material. And so when you sit with the physiological sensation of guilt, which for most people happens in the gut, okay, when you sit with that, it's going to be unpleasant, and there's going to be a fair quantity of it. Sometimes it takes a long period of time. I generally find that you can measure the amount of time it takes to allow guilt to leave in minutes or hours. The challenge is allowing myself to actually do that. And that's because we're talking about some sophisticated stuff here in terms of emotions. But most people, especially when they just come into counseling, only have two emotions: pain and pleasure. And we have resistance to that which is painful. We're averse to pain, and we move toward pleasure. And this guilt is exquisitely painful. And so a lot of my job is to bring somebody back to their guilt and to normalize not necessarily the behavior that they feel guilty about, but simply the fact that they feel guilty about it. Hey, it's good that you feel guilty about this. It means you have a conscience. It means you're a human being. Also, what's it like to just acknowledge the fact that you're human, and if you had known better, you would have done better. And now you do know better, and now you won't make that decision. And then also, what is it to just really sit with the physical experience of despair and depression and pain? And the last thing I want to mention when we're doing any grief process or any guilt process is oftentimes people, one of the other dangers of the sequential model is I feel like I get to acceptance and then I am done. And that unfortunately is not the case. The way these things work, like I said, is in a stack. So I will go all the way around the circle and maybe I'll erase this part of the stack. But guess what? There's a bunch more underneath it. And a lot of times, the healthier I become, let's say this is some sort of litmus point. If I become healthier up here, let's say this is my perception of healthier is up here, here's where I start. I can actually start to go deeper. At this point in my process, when I am this healthy, I can really only go down to here. Because I can't tolerate some of this deeper material, right? Some of my deeper guilt and particularly my deeper shame. The process of being rejected from our family of origin is terrifying and incredibly, incredibly painful. Many of us have gone through a process like that and don't necessarily realize it because, again, it's too painful to believe. But a lot of us grow up in a household where love is conditional. Okay? Yes, I'll love you, and here's how you act. If you act outside this way, you will eventually be rejected. I can think of many clients who said to me, they say, you're deep in your addiction, and if you go back home, there's a good chance you're going to relapse because you've done this like 10 times. And they say, but Greg, if I set a limit with my dad, he'll reject me. I'm really afraid he will. And one of the things we have to contend with is the reality that that's true sometimes. And that's a really hard thing to do. And you get into some real difficult situations with people when you have to choose between sobriety and life and acceptance by your family system. Your family system can't tolerate you being healthy, for example, which does happen sometimes. It can be a really difficult situation. So again, the healthier you get, the stronger you become. The stronger you become, the deeper you can go. And that's why this process sometimes feels like it's never ending. And that's one other thing that's important to point out to a client is, hey, look at the growth. Wow, look at us, we're working on this thing, and this is actually a pretty deep experience that you're having here. And when we started, you were really just looking at your behavior in the last couple of years. Now we're really talking about some older behavior that's deeper down. Oh, okay. So no, it's not going to last forever. It's just a process of growth. Make sense?
Would be fair to say that shame stems more from things that are done to you, like being abused, being abandoned, whereas guilt more from things that you do, like I feel guilty that I
Exactly, yes.
committed a crime to-
Shame 100% of the time involves other people. You cannot feel the emotion shame without it being in a social context. Guilt is always about you and about your perception of who you should be versus your perception of who you are. And actually, if you want to get really interesting, Alfred Adler was one of the founders of modern psychology, and he said guilt is a wasted emotion. And the reason he said that is because guilt is saying, judge me for who I want to be versus who I actually am. Judge me on my intentions and not my behavior, which we all do. Every one of us in our relationships, one of the reasons relationships are so hard is I can only judge my partner on their behavior, and I judge myself on my intentions. Well, honey, I didn't mean to be a jerk when I said that. You really should have understood what I was trying to say. And I guess I did come off like a jerk, but I didn't mean to. So I'm really not going to take full accountability and acceptance for the shitty thing I said because I didn't really mean it. I was tired and I'm going to give myself a pass based on my intentions. But you, oh, buddy, that behavior is not going to work for me. Okay? Don't really give a shit about your intention. So that's one of the sort of elements of guilt that I think is really interesting to look at with human behavior. Do you have something?
I was just gonna say, I've heard guilt spoken about as like I did something bad, and shame is I am bad.
Yeah.
Exactly right. Yeah, perfect distinction. Guilt, I made a mistake. Shame, I am a mistake. Guilt, I did something bad. Shame, I am something bad.